Hi, everybody, and welcome to Office Hours. Alex Lindsay's still on vacation, but I believe we'll be back tomorrow. I might be wrong about that, but hopefully so. This is where we gather daily to talk about all things media, technology, and production. We do it in a format where you set the agenda. So here's how it works. We use a dedicated real-time question submission system called Mukana. Whatever platform brought you here to best experience and participate in the show, you should see a link first to the direct Office Hours Zoom session, where the normal question and answer area holds not questions and answers in our system, but another link. This one takes you to the Mukana web portal. That is where you can join our live real-time chat discussing the show. And if you explore the tabs, you'll see in that area, you'll find that you can post your own questions to the panel. Now, these questions have votes displayed. That's how you become the producer of the show, because these questions get voted on by everybody, and whatever gets the most votes, well, that's what we discuss first and generally in the most depth. Now, some days we have a special focus, and Saturday is traditionally Education Day. So from 9 until 11 a.m., after we finish the first 2 hours here, Emily Russo will be by to host a discussion of all things teaching related. Alex, Emily, and the education crew are working on something special, and so that part of the show is not on YouTube at the moment, as if I'm not mistaken about that. But if your interests are in any part of teaching or training, you should really check that out because it's a great show. Okay, all that said, I think that takes care of the basic details. It's time to get to the real reason we're here, which is the questions you have put in and voted up. So, Courtney, did you get the prompt review going? And if not, you did. Okay, do you want to do the honors and read the first question that we have in?
Okay, I'm using the Zoom client on Windows 10. Does anyone on the panel know of a way to quickly mute the sound in the webinar window with just a simple keystroke, trying to avoid having to pop open the volume mixer window trying to avoid having to pop up the volume mixer window to kill the audio?
Great, that came from Haywood and Brentwood. And go ahead, David Brady wants to dive into that.
Sure. On Windows, Alt-M is the global mute all except host. And you can also pop the panelist view out, and there should be a button as host that says mute all in that panelist view.
Excellent. So simple solutions to the problem. I guess that means we're going on to the next question. Go ahead, Courtney.
From Rupert McRae in Dallas, Texas. Any comments on filming or live streaming fireworks?
Ooh, that's an interesting topic. So it depends a little bit on whether you're going to be filming or shooting, live streaming. Fireworks, always bright lights against a black background, is always a bit of a challenge. Let's go to John Preto first for some advice.
Before they made it illegal, one guy had his drone on Las Vegas Boulevard, and he flew his drone down Las Vegas Boulevard as the fireworks went off. It was spectacular.
Oh, I bet it was. So in general, my experience, and I've done this a couple of times, back in Arizona, I used to go out and try to get still photography of fireworks. That requires a really long exposure, particularly if you want to aggregate more than one burst of fireworks, and so that you don't have to time exactly your shutter when it goes off. But video obviously is shooting a series of frames over the course of time. So the key is going to be setting as wide an aperture as you can, trying not to use too much gain, because gain generally adds noise, and the more gain, particularly ISO up, unless your camera is set up to do that, will generally tend to make the background, which is often black, kind of messy. And if you really want crisp ones, hope for a windy evening of fireworks display, because in my experience, unless you get stuff in the first 5 minutes or 10 minutes, smoke up in the sky tends to obscure the really nice pictures after that. Sky, you want to talk about some things you've done?
I have used my iPhone a year ago, and it came out quite nicely. So there was some automation in there. Obviously, I didn't do it through Filmic Pro or anything. So I would think your shutter speed would have something to do with it, as well as your aperture. But again, the iPhone just did some basic stuff for me.
Yeah, it's gotten better. Tim Holm, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the iPhone is a good idea like that. It's pretty wide angle and everything, so it depends on how far away you are. But also you need to consider the sound aspects. Are you going to be talking during your stream? If you are, try to improve on that in any way that you can get any kind of microphone source closer to your mouth, or get something you can plug into your iPhone that you can do that with as well. The fireworks sounds will be still in the distance probably in that case, but just depending on where you are. There's a lot of light in fireworks, so you'll see the fireworks better than you may see the foreground or even the background, but it can definitely be done. It's pretty fun to do.
Absolutely. And in my experience, the tighter your aperture, the less light you let in, the fireworks will gain more color. I've had experiences where the fireworks are so bright that everything turns out kind of white looking, even if in real life they're really pretty and they've taken a lot of time to get those colors right. Hopefully those will give you some tips. Good luck with the process, and pop back if you have time and show us what you shot. Let's go on to the next question, Courtney.
From Paul Wallace, or Valhus, as he says to pronounce it in the panel. He asked, microphones like the Shure MV7, the Audio Technica ATR2100x, and others also support XLR. How do they stack up against each other and versus regular XLR mics?
Okay, so the connection stuff on microphones. I'll just make this comment to start off. The reason that XLR is preferred for professional mics is it allows, it is built for balanced audio. And balanced audio is a little bit of electrical trickery where they inverse a pole and suppress noise. So long cable runs still can be virtually silent if a microphone is at distance from something and you have a lot of cable there. The little inexpensive 3.5 millimeter, if they are not balanced, some of them are, but often they are not, really don't do that. So if you have a long extension of a simple 2-conductor wire, that acts as a big antenna and you can have problems with your sound picking it up. Courtney, you have some other comments about that?
Well, one thing, the difference between the two in the same microphone, in other words, a microphone that has USB and XLR balanced output. The difference is if you're coming USB out, the A to D converter will be in the microphone itself. If you like your A to D converter in your mixer, then use the XLR connector, and that'll give you, if you deem that to be a better A to D converter and more control, it'll give you a little more control over your output than using the USB output.
Excellent. Better answer. Go ahead, Leo.
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting way to look also on the video, where we've got lots of people who are on webcams that are USB, and they're now asking how do they move to HDMI. And these microphones are acting as a bridging between what is effectively a single rig setup to enable you to go into a larger or better, if better is the right term, environment. So people start off with a USB microphone because that's easy. It plugs in, it works. And they buy something out of a box and then don't pull their hair out. And then they will eventually move up to an XLR. But the interesting thing, particularly on some of those microphones, are dynamic, and most people will then find that the microphone isn't loud enough, so they end up having to put in a cloud lifter before they then put in their input, and you'll end up, they'll sit there going, I've spent all this money on all these bits, and I just saw somebody, and it's like, I like the look of that one on the screen, and that's the one I want. So I think it's quite a clever thing for them to be able to give in here is the basic way to get a really good microphone to work on your laptop by just plugging in on USB and get you going.
Nice. All right. I think that pretty much covers it. We don't have any other hands up, so let's move on to the next question, Courtney.
Sorry, every time they highlight the question, it scrolls off the screen. Next question is from Rupert McRae from Dallas, Texas. Dolby has an article on why high-fidelity audio is important for telehealth. It can mitigate the risk of misdiagnosis and build doctor-patient relationships faster. Does this make audio and audio engineers lifesavers?
Oh, what an interesting take on this. I will say that telehealth is an important thing. I know the first time my wife ever did a telehealth call with her physician, she was just feeling miserable, caught the flu or something, and was in bed. And the difference between having to get up, get dressed, and go to a doctor to see them, and to be able to stay comfortable at home and do it by telehealth. But I can certainly see why some of the aspects of a personal visit where the doctor can see you and hear you might make things easier. Sky, go ahead. You raised your hand.
Well, as far as being a lifesaver, my very first job in the industry was with a medical team's organization that was helping DARPA, and they were actually working 20 plus years ago on telemedicine from surgeons going into a robotics tent somewhere closer to the front of the heat of the battle in military purposes. So our engineers and audio technicians, lifesavers, they're part of the food chain. That helps, absolutely.
Absolutely. I think in all smart devices, whether it's Apple's ecosystem or Android or anything else, they all have now smart devices that you can use for some forms of the burgeoning telemedicine industry. Leo, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, this reminds me of that John F. Kennedy quote of when he went to NASA and he saw the janitor asked him what he's doing, and he said, "I'm putting a man on the moon." We aren't necessarily the doctors, but everything goes towards the delivering the services.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next question. Go ahead.
Okay, from, I think this is the one we're on. Here we go. Tim Holm from San Lorenzo says, I can get a Samsung UN43TU700D at Costco for $330. It has 120 hertz refresh rate, is 4K with HDR, and has the smart TV stuff. Why wouldn't I get this to go with a Mac Mini instead of a much more expensive Dell monitor?
Does somebody want to weigh in on the differences of using an actual monitor versus a TV set to do your viewing for your UI? No takers? Go ahead. Sky, and then Courtney.
Well, I'd rather have Courtney go first, but from a colorist point of view, I'd have an opinion.
I'm not a colorist, but you have more adjustment over the Dell monitor. They're much more color accurate. But if color accuracy is not your mainstay, and you're dealing with zoom, it screws up the colors anyway. I'd go with the bigger screen or the cheaper screen. If it's that's a 43 inch is a pretty good sized display, and you can't get a good Dell monitor in 43 inches size. So if size is important to you, an LCD panel is pretty much an LCD panel. It's the interface controls that are different.
Sky, and then Leo.
Well, and again, as an engineer, I bow to Courtney's recommendation. As an end user, I know we would always put a client monitor in, because what would the end client be actually looking at mostly? And so I see Jason kind of shaking his head about you always want at least that last in the food chain of how bad it might look. But as the engineer or the colorist at the front, you're trying to get the best you can to get the highest quality that you are delivering. And so that's where the more expensive is. If it's your responsibility to make the best thing you can, I would do everything you can to get the best instruments to help. And I'm sure David's got an opinion too.
Well, we have Jason, Leo, and then David. So we're going to go in that order. Go ahead, Jason.
I always say when it comes to monitors versus panels, it depends on if you're consuming or producing. Usually if I'm producing content, I'll go with monitors for computer stuff. If I'm consuming media, I'll put up a back panel display. Also, I've also noticed that there typically tends to be washing out closer to the edges on bigger screen TVs if they're sitting up really close, if I'm creating or putting together work. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at buying or purchasing a monitor.
Leo.
Yeah. The one of the things that normally catches it out, and I can't tell you about this particular model, is the resolutions. So they'll say that TV resolutions and monitor resolutions are similar, but there is you can find that things that are built for TV are either just hitting that level and then not the full resolution of the screen that you get on a monitor. And I've seen this a lot of times with used to get all the time. Also, there is differences in types of screens. There are two different types of LED screens, and David is nodding, so I'm hoping he's going to give you the better answer on what the differences are.
Let's go to David.
The one difference I know with consumer televisions versus computer monitors is sometimes the finish of the glass, where the television will have a glossy finish. The computer monitors will have a matte finish. IPS technology is another thing to consider. And for $100 or so more, you can get that 43-inch LG 4K. Might not have the 120 refresh rate, but you can also split it into 4 physical 1080 monitors, and it's a pretty sweet deal.
Yeah, we're living in a great time because it used to be that the difference between a television set and a computer monitor was a massive difference back in the days of regular NTSC. But now the TVs that you find even in the department stores have a lot more capability than they ever did before. So I think it gets harder. So I'm glad we are able to talk about this often, because maybe you can find something that's just right for you. Let's go on to the next question.
Okay, from Rupert McCrae, frequently on the panel here, in Dallas, Texas. Microsoft is building in chip technology to the Microsoft Surface to allow chip-to-cloud data protection. With the Azure platform, does this give Microsoft an edge on end-to-end encryption and management?
And John Pruitt immediately raised his hand. So John, go ahead.
So, as many of you know, I work in cybersecurity. For me, I think that it doesn't give them an advantage because of the number of flaws we've been seeing in chips lately. And that means that you would have a little bit harder time maintaining your code and updating rather a software fix. I think I would prefer as an engineer to go with software as opposed to hard coding it into the chip.
Interesting. I do know that just in my regular daily practice, and everybody knows I'm kind of invested in the Apple ecosystem, the amount of pings I've gotten and the amount of evolution I've seen, particularly around security, identity security and data security, has really been one of the most biggest changes I run. I never saw two-factor authentication queries, and now I get them. If I don't get one in a day, I'm surprised about it. It just shows you how big a deal all of these topics are, and anything that anybody can do, in my opinion, to increase chip security or data security and ID security without making it too difficult to use so that people don't, is going to be a good thing going forward, because our data is our lives these days. We're just so much out there. John, do you have something that's...
Yeah, just to add to what you're saying, this really isn't for end user security. This is more about data security for the thread that goes from the corporate enterprise to the cloud. So that's why I'm giving my particular answer. You are totally correct from an end user perspective. Make it simple, make it easy. Use I like the push notifications that a lot of applications are giving us now, where you just click on a checkbox to say, yes, that's me, because you're logging in on your computer and you get the push on your phone. That's much more secure.
Excellent. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Jason Seep in Marietta. Indy 5, it's out with the latest Tricaster update, but not for mere mortals. New tech stated by the end of the month back in June. What gives?
Anybody following the NDI 5 rollout saga with clarity and wants to help us understand it? Or are we, looks like we're missing on this one. I guess it's too new and nobody here is on the seed. Jeffrey, go ahead and talk about what you know.
Yeah, there have been some problems in the beginning, and which, you kind of expect that. That's why they slowly roll it out. And of course, everybody else has to join the wait list and wait for NDI 5 to come out. There probably is a beta group there that can't talk about anything, so that's where we are.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on then.
Well, Jason's back with another one here. Jason Sipe of Marietta. The chip shortage of 2021 appears as if it will roll into 2022, with some saying that it will get worse before it gets better. I think Alex said that the other day. How will this affect the panel's equipment purchase in the next 6 months?
This is going to be interesting. Let's go to John, then Jim Hankins, and then Leo. Go ahead, John.
So I purchased a ATEM Mini Extreme ISO because of that. As opposed to, I had the money sitting in the bank and I would rather have saved it. But by the time I was ready to buy it, it wouldn't have been available, I don't think, as the panel advised me. So I went ahead and pulled the trigger this week.
Interesting. Was it Jim next?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm purchasing things earlier than I normally would, so that I have it in the queue, which probably contributes to the problem as everybody starts to panic buy. But I'm not panic buying, but I'm making a Guy's week this week. So
good for Guy. Leo, go ahead.
So where it's affecting me is when I talk to customers about installations And we have to put a caveat to say, we're telling you what this price is and we're telling you what you can get. If you're interested in doing it, do it now. If you sit there and dither around until after the summer, you may not get your install. And that's it. It's not like we'll say, oh, we'll just push it back another month or two. We'll just say it's just by the time you will want to do your install or you can afford to do it, what you actually put on a piece of paper and it may not even be relevant anymore because it'll be superseded or just, the view is that a lot of products are just not going to ship at all.
Interesting. Courtney?
Yeah, this always makes me nervous in buying any electronic product that has to do with video right before NAB, because as soon as I purchase something, it will be closed out and put on sale after NAB because they've come out with a new version. But with this chip shortage, you may not be able to get that new version that's announced at NAB in October until the following year rather than a couple of months out.
John Pewitt?
Yeah, just to go back to something I recalled when they're talking about cars, they're taking features out of new vehicles because of the chip shortage. So I would be concerned about the new gear being announced at NAB being missing features that we have come to expect, potentially because of the chip shortage.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me. I mean, I knew intellectually how many things are driven by these computer system on chips and other types of chips, but it still has shocked me the breadth of the disruption that these factories not being online and not pumping out as many as the market needs. How big that disruption has been. Victor, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I do. A good example is Universal Audio, who has recently made a decision to save some of their newer chipsets for some of their higher end models, and they've now redistributed some of their lower stuff with older chips that are on hand. So you really have to do your research because you may be getting, at the chip level, some older technology, as John stated, that doesn't live up to some of the promises that we would have normally. So I think it's a time when we have to either, do some research, or you may have to opt for some of the higher end models of what we want because the manufacturers seem to be holding onto those chips for those higher end models. At least in Universal Audio's case, that's the truth.
That's interesting. All right. I think that takes care of that subject. Let's move on.
Okay, Leo Mendel from Pinner, UK. Building a streaming PC. The video card I normally install is an Nvidia 1050 Ti as it supports 3x NVENC encodes. These cards are now at a premium. Are they ever? And any suggestions for a Quadro equivalent?
Anybody into graphics cards and know this market well enough to give Leo suggestions? Jeffrey, go ahead.
Just like with the audio chip department, the graphics department, there's a big chip shortage. So trying to get those cards are going to be not that possible. But I've seen a couple of YouTube channels that have live streams going that are constantly looking at the different manufacturers, and when a card comes in, it will announce that on their page, so you can keep that open and watching that. Otherwise, you're going to be paying premium prices for a little while, at least for a year, is my guess, as cards are going to try to ramp up to demand.
Ken Jordan, and then off to Courtney.
Yeah, this might not be the most cost-effective way, but at least you can get the cards. Is to actually buy computers which already have them in, because the mainstream manufacturers, they get access to the card. So you might have to buy a machine which has the card you want in, and then take it out. That might be if you're one of a quicker way of doing it rather than waiting.
So if you need it bad enough, you'll buy the whole box and just take out the one part you need. Boy, that's a tough call, but I know people are doing that. That's how important these are to everybody. Courtney, you had a thought?
Ken just covered that. So.
Okay, fair enough. Then moving on to the next question.
Okay, Stan Chan from Roseville says, why do most popular YouTube streamers have Sony rigs with a Sennheiser 416? Are they being paid to use it, or is this a better setup for YouTube videos?
I'm going to weigh in a little bit on this because as a longtime VO guy, well, let's have Jeffrey do first, and then Jeffrey, then Victor, then I'll close it out. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Most likely, yeah. Well, if you're a good influencer, you might have talked with Sony and they might have sent you one, and it's very possible that you're using that camera. Same thing with Canon. If Canon has some sort of influencer program, maybe your first one was purchased, but after that you might have gotten some free product from the company, or free to use but not resell product. So that's a very big possibility. As for the rigs with the Sennheiser 4.6, I use Sony myself with the Handycam, and the wireless lab, the best part about that is you don't have to have external wires in it, because the shoe will actually control all the audio into the camera. Yeah, it's really just a choice over anything, unless they get free product from that.
Victor, then Leo.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Jeffrey said. Basically, companies like Sony and Sennheiser are very apt to give product out to big promoters like this. Gerald Undone just did a video of about 30 top YouTube people, and most of them were using Sony S7s, and most of them were using Sennheiser 416. I asked about it the other day here, and Alex was very quick to point out that indeed it's because those companies are giving them free product.
Leo, then Courtney.
So I look at it a slightly different way, the same way as I looked at it about the USB microphones. There's a lot of people out there that this isn't their role. They're not necessarily a camera person or an audio person. What they want is to jump to the top of getting to where they need to look reasonable very fast. They've been on a Logitech camera and they want to move up, and so they just look at who else is looking really good online and they just go and buy that equipment, and short circuit having to learn about different things. And there's enough videos out there to say this one is good and this one is good, and people go, yep, that'll do. I'm a YouTuber, I'm not a specialist in this area, so that's why they choose them.
Courtney.
Even if Sennheiser isn't giving you a free 416, which I kind of doubt they'll do, but knowing how stingy Sennheiser is. But I think the 416 is a choice. A lot of YouTubers want to, up their look, so they don't want to have the look of a lavalier on or the noise of clothing noise, so they'll use an open microphone, and 416 is a good choice. And a lot of them, of course, are operating in a studio that's been soundproof to a good deal, since they do this for a living. And just out of frame above 416 gives them a clean frame and the ability to move around and still get nice, clean, open sounding sound.
And I'm going to go take you back in history. Once upon a time, nobody I ever saw in voiceovers, and I've been doing voiceover stuff for 35, 40 years, I didn't see anybody use a shotgun mic ever in the early days. All sorts of dynamics, all sorts of large diaphragm condensers. I'd never seen a shotgun. Then there was this guy, the immortal Ernie Anderson, who had one of the greatest voices in broadcast. And those of you who are old enough will remember, he was the announcer for the Love Boat TV show. He was the daybook announcer in Los Angeles for the local network affiliate, ABC at the time. And he had a magnificent voice, and he uses a 416, in part because his voice, booming as it was, needed to cut through the clutter on TV. And so even when he went on, I think the Tonight Show, and maybe he was on with David Letterman or something, you can find this back on YouTube, they eschewed all the mics in the regular thing and brought his 416 into that interview as he were talking to him about his daybook announcing and the stuff that he did for the TV. And the 416 took off like a rocket then. And still to this day, it has a reputation in the voiceover community as a mic that cuts through background music and everything else. It is a fine microphone, low self noise, but it has a particular sound to it. And I know a lot of voiceover people who will have a big, large diaphragm condenser in their voice booth, and they'll also have a 416, and they use one or the other depending on the kind of sound they want out of it. So sometimes these things just take off and become iconic because they have a particular use and they hit it at a particular time. And that's my story about Sennheiser 416s. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Stan Chan in Roseville. Does anyone have a great mobile streaming rig? No laptop, iPhone 13 Pro Max, iPad Pro 12-inch M1, and anything else that can fit in a backpack.
Mobile streaming rigs. Has anybody been out doing mobile streaming? John Preto.
I'd like to know where he got his iPhone 13 because I would like one of those myself.
Yeah, a 13 Pro Max. Wow, he must be on some really special list. Maybe he lives next door to Tim Cook. Anybody have any thoughts about, though, the generic question of a mobile streaming rig? Somebody here must surely be doing that. I guess maybe we're not. David, go ahead.
Not that I've been doing it lately, but an old Cerevo Live Shell X. It's a 3-engine H265 1080p encoder, HDMI in. You can use a USB modem for cellular, wireless connection, wired. Saved my bacon at the early onset of the pandemic at the place I go on Sundays.
Okay, there you go. Jeffrey Powers.
I used to, well, before pandemic, I did a lot of travel in Korea. And we were doing these events where I would be live streaming a judging contest for startup companies in Korea, and I'd have to take a very minimal part. So I took a laptop and I took a single camera that would actually be this camera right here that I'm using, that I'd use a capture card into. So one big camera, and then of course I had an older iPhone which I would use for roaming. This time around, I'm going to give this a try. These are the OBS bot. Tiny cameras. They're the 2x gimbal cameras, a point tilt 2x zoom, and putting them close by, I'll be able to control them, and then of course control their position and stuff like that. So these are perfect for the backpack, and they're all USB cameras.
Cool. Thank you very much. And by the way, kudos on the 4th of July shirt for those of you out around the world. It's the American 4th of July or Independence Day, and Jeffrey has his patriotic flag shirt on. Moving on to the next question.
Okay. From James Babbitt in San Diego. He says, Ripple Training is having a 4th of July sale, speaking of the 4th. Any recommendations for their tutorials? Final Cut Pro, DaVinci Resolve, and Motion, etc.?
Yes, please. All of them. Ken Jordan?
It all depends on what you're wanting to do. If you're interested in graphic motion, then Motion. If you have a Mac, then either DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut. But it all depends on what all their training is great. So, prioritize on what your service you're looking to offer, and then choose that training first.
And I'm biased because they're friends of mine, but they do generally they're considered in the Mac community the class of the pack in terms of specific training for those programs. Sky Gleason, then John Pruitt. Let's go to Sky.
If it's cost effective, it's also a great introduction of the delineation between the difference in the concepts of Final Cut and Resolve, because they are two different languages, both serving the same need. So again, echoing what Ripple Training is very effective, because they're not just teachers, they're users. And so they have good muscle memory of why they're doing why they're teaching you.
John Pruitt.
So I've done the Ripple training for Resolve, and I'm currently going through the one for Final Cut Pro. They are not friends of mine, so I can be a little bit more blunt. This is literally the most fantastic training I've ever been through that was pre-recorded. They have a way of going through the lessons that are clear, concise, and very makes it easy to do. And I've done other courses where they've also provided material to cut, and it just hasn't worked as well. It just doesn't flow. So I just find their methodology works really well for me. And I've tried other courses. So,
as Alex is fond of saying, it can be easy to create or easy to what did you say? Easy to make training or easy to watch training, but it can't be both. And they put in the work necessary to make these things good. So we all really appreciate the work that they do, because they do it really well. Let's move on to the next topic.
Okay, sorry, it's just jumping around.
There's no names. There's no names on the next couple ones, just so you know.
Well, Stan Chen from Roseville, is that what you're talking about? No names? Oops. Oh, sorry. From No Name. I have a new ATEM Mini Extreme ISO coming next week. Thanks, Guy. Any tips or tricks I should be aware of?
Okay. John Pruitt.
That question's from me. I'm not sure why my name didn't show up.
Oh, well, thank you for not being anonymous. At least now we know. So you want to know just tips, tricks about in general? You are well experienced, so you know about HDMI cameras and the rest of that stuff. So Leo has some tips, and so does John Preto, and so does Brady.
Two tips I always use with the Extreme ISO. First of all, I will record it. I normally run it with 4 cameras and then out to a PC that does the streaming. I will then take an HDMI out of the PC that's doing the streaming back into the 8th channel, so that when I do the ISO record, I'm recording all of my cameras and my program out that's coming, including anything that I'm putting in mixing. And then the second thing I'll do is I'll put my 5th input will be my video play. And then I'll take my video play, and if there's a big screen in there, you take the video out of, I think there's 1 and 2. You take that out and you just pin that to on the right hand side, you pin that to the 5th one. So basically your video out or your video playing is going through the ATEM as well and onto the screen, so you can control everything. Also quite nice to be able to move that to multi-view when you're trying to set up the cameras and you're shouting at somebody down there to move their camera. They can see it on the big screen.
Let's move on to John Preto.
It does not come with the USB cable. Make sure you get the right one to work with it. Otherwise it won't find it.
Oh, and David Brady's next.
Yeah, with ISO recording, you don't need to unplug the drive from it. You can FTP right into the switcher, pull things across, and those ISO recordings also build a native Resolve project right up from the get-go.
I think Sky's raised finger is live. JJ McKenna is just resting his face. I didn't know whether that finger was I want to talk or not. So Sky, go.
Yes, I'll put 4 fingers up. Yes, and that you're learning Resolve is perfect because, to David's point, the T5, the little SSD, is what recording device we used on Matt in the kitchen, and it's just kind of magical that you get your entire show split and time sunk and locked. I think you're cheating, actually.
Yeah, that kind of circumstance is the thing where I think Resolve is big steps ahead of everybody else, because when you're cutting on one of those devices, it talks to the software talks to it, and it all writes to a file where you can go back and edit your show and make corrections.
And specific, that little SSD was just also kind of magical in storage. 1 terabyte for $100.
Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, I've had mine for a good few weeks now, and it's been on all the time, but it is on a stand, so it's slightly raised off, and I'm just feeling now the aluminium on the stand is warm, so mine's been on 24/7, but it is warm. It does run warm compared to the Mini, so raising it off the desk and on a stand, well, for me, I haven't had any issues with it, so that might be something to consider.
Okay, Leo Mandel, you want to add something?
Yeah, on Ken's point, when we use it in a flight case, we realized that we were restricting the airflow because it comes either side and then it goes out the back. So it's got 2 fans that drag it through the center and then out the back. And we ended up realizing we overcooked one in the hot sun once, so we had to cool it down. The other thing I would do, is I was saying about bringing the videos in that way, I also bring in my audio from my desk onto the mic 1. Again, I never use it for the play out, but I'm just throwing everything onto the ISO, so that, as I said, it's all there. Everything's there. So you walk around with that at the end of a show. There's a 2 terabyte one with the whole show on it.
Yeah, I will say that I've learned that recording at least scratch audio on everything you possibly can really does help in post, because if nothing else, your synchronization happens faster and more accurately when you're trying to build things like multicams. Leo, did you want to mention something about that?
There is a slight gotcha, and you realize that it records the videos. All the ISO videos are recorded without sound, or I've found them to be recorded without sound, and separately it records the sound into 2 different folders. So it's not as that caught me out because I was expecting that the video of a camera would record with the sound on that.
Does it
ISO.
print some sort of time sync so that they automatically match up, or do you have to manually do that?
You can just drag them straight into Final Cut or Premiere and just line them up, and as said, Resolve. But I haven't noticed that it records the sound unless I've missed a setting, and someone's going to say, "Oh, you didn't turn on that setting."
Okay, well, some things to think about. So hopefully that gives you some advanced warning of things. John, let's move on to the next question.
Okay, I don't know if this is from John, but it seems to be anonymous. Maybe it is from John. So I recently purchased ScreenFlow 10, upgrading from 9. 10 does not record from my Blackmagic Design ATEM, though it sees it for preview. 9 works fine, though it crashes more frequently. Any troubleshooting tips? I've already opened a case with the vendor.
Ooh, that's interesting. I upgraded, but I have not had a chance to use ScreenFlow since I did that. And so I'm interested in the answer, but I have no knowledge. Does anybody here on the panel use ScreenFlow regularly? Unfortunately, we're missing, swinging and missing on this one. So hopefully somebody in the regular chat will have, that's a wider audience, might have some ideas about that. If not, wait a couple of days and come back around, re-ask the question, and we'll see if maybe we can find a panel with some different people, and somebody will know that. Let's move on.
Okay, Stan Chan from Roseville says, I just purchased a Sphere L22 on back order, but while on a vacation, I found out that Townsend Labs was purchased by Universal Audio. First question is, can the Sphere L22 reduce the amount of mics I purchase? And will UA change anything with the new product?
Why would you want to reduce the number of mics you purchase? I thought that was the whole purpose of life, was to add more and more microphones until you pass away. Anyway, I'm being facetious, obviously, but anybody have any, Universal Audio seems to be a company that's really on the move now. They have their stuff is, they're constantly coming out with new plugins. They're kind of right at the leading edge of things. Jeffrey, what do you know?
Well, when a company gets purchased, they'll do one of two things. They'll either end a life of product, or they'll sell the product off to somebody else, or actually three things. They'll continue on without any problems. So I'm guessing in this case they'll continue on without a problem. If not, they'll end up either selling the microphone or the patents for the microphone, which would then mean that somebody else could then start making the microphone. Well, and yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if you could even see generic versions come out as well.
Oh, that would be interesting. All right. That seems to be the only responses we have available to you. So let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael. When you're cutting a show on Zoom, does it just entail using the keyboard shortcuts for gallery and speaker view? I'm thinking that using a MIDI controller and Bome's MIDI translator could be a useful way to make cutting the show a lot more fluid.
John Pruitt.
I'm much more silent than I thought I would be. I'm cutting the show today. Hopefully I'm not doing too horrible a job of it, but the main thing I've done so far is just to use the keyboard shortcuts. But if you do have to pin a participant to show their video, then you're going to have to use your mouse to do that, because I haven't found a keyboard shortcut to do that, at least not within the Zoom client. Now, Zoom OSC, totally different beast, but we're not using that here. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and whatever answer we came up with, obviously we are not Alex, and we are not the folks who are working on the back end. And we do know it has been announced that Office Hours 2.0 is on its way toward us. So we don't know what the topology of all of that will be. Maybe these keyboard shortcuts will persist across. Maybe there will be new ones. Maybe there will be a different way to do that. A little bit, this is fixing the car while we're driving it. So who knows? Leo, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'm talking about more generic rather than Office Hours 2.0. And there is, I think one of the things to look at is Zoom OSC and what you can do with Zoom OSC. It is I wouldn't say a steep learning curve. It's a big thing to get your head around, because it's not doing what you have spent your time. Again, it's that sort of, you've got to get it out of the box and plug all these bits together, particularly because on the Stream Deck you may have to change. But it is worth doing. It is worth going and investigating on that and having a look at that.
Bill, you're a lot more quiet.
Oops, sorry about that. It was so much easier when I had the hardware mute button, but I got to learn this. Moving on, let's get to the next question.
Okay, from David Brady in New York. Says, when overscanning for screen scraping, is the magic number 107% over? Is there any fear of cropping someone's head off if a little too much?
Well, that depends on how they frame the shot. Jeffrey Powers, go ahead.
Yeah, it does depend on how they frame the shot, because right now, as I'm scraping the YouTube, I don't know if it's 107%, but as the thing that's actually doing the scrape back and forth is an actual panelist, there's a lot less text that's on the top. So now I can kind of just cut off the bottom part, and then you still have the top end. So if I put up frame lines, your eye level will still be on the frame line. So if I did this as what we call the producer or attendee, then I would have to do the full 107% to take out the recording and all the other dirty text on there.
Fair enough. David Brady.
Do we know if that translates to if you were bringing a native Zoom room in with the graphics, the stuff that it has, not the NDI version?
Does anybody have
I don't
experience with that? And you don't know, Jeffrey? Okay. JJ McKenna has a thought.
Actually, I've seen it translate from anywhere between 106 and 112, based off of whether or not there are additional frames. So what we've seen, for instance, with when Hustlage has been put together for the 2.0, they've reframed it to as high as 112 to make sure that the frames fit together correctly.
So depending on the amount of stuff around the frame, you may have to go as high as 112% to get rid of all the rest of that interface rash, for lack of a better term. But it may be as little as 106%, but factors in there and just look at it, I guess. Jeffrey?
Another thing, I think it was Andy that mentioned it earlier, is our Jonas wanted to, if you get a 4K monitor and then, because the best you can do is 1080p, you get a 4K monitor and then you just do a part of a screen, then some of the text will actually be above and below the video, and then you might not have to do 107 at that point.
Fair enough. Moving on to the next question.
Okay, from Andy Carluccio in Washington, D.C. Periodically, while watching content on my new Apple TV 4K, lucky you, my screen will cut out and the HDMI connection appears to reset itself. My screen is HDR capable, and the dropouts only occur when watching from the Apple TV. Diagnostic ideas?
Anyone? Leo has some thoughts about intermittence.
Cable. It's always the cable. In my experience with HDMI, it's always the cable. And funny enough, sometimes the more expensive cables are even worse.
Interesting. Well, that's not comforting. Jason Sipe.
It depends on what he means by drops or cuts out. If it drops to black, it could be a bandwidth issue, which again is still the cable. But this to me sounds like, seems like it's more of a bandwidth issue. So swap out that cable, make sure the cable is correct for your TV and the Apple 4K. If that doesn't work, then it could be your internet connection that's coming in that might periodically drop out. You may have the bandwidth, but if you're coming on Wi-Fi as opposed to being hardlined in, that could be a bandwidth and a coverage issue.
David Brady.
Yeah, and also make sure it's not one of those directional red mirror cables. Those things are the bane of my existence.
Courtney.
Also, if he's saying it renegotiate HDMI, it could be an HDCP change. So if there's one program that was open copyright and the next program is copyright, it could force HDCP renegotiation. That could be why it goes to black before it comes up back again.
Jason Sipe again.
I really want to know if it still does this with 720p content versus 4K content, because then I think that would solve a lot of your problems. And if it's just isolated to the Apple TV, it could also be that input. So try swapping inputs as well, just to be sure that's not an issue.
Why do I suddenly want to build a Thanksgiving turkey out of old cables and then put a little thought bubble above it saying cable? And I'm weird. Let's move on to the next question. Okay,
from Douglas Carmichael. One memorable audio moment was at a festival with an 80s cover band and a less appreciative audience. Once the front-of-house engineer inserted a SSL bus compressor, the audience started dancing and was more engaged. When would you use the said compressor? Only if you have a dance floor.
Okay, boy, we could have 2 or 3 shows just about audio compression. I think it is such a deep and powerful topic. I mean, compressed audio is used in so many different things to accomplish so many aims, and I would probably opine that it's overused in so many cases to try to make something sound better than it actually does. But I'm not an audio engineer, so I wish we had at least 1 or 2. Jeffrey, you want to tackle some of it from your perspective?
Yeah, when you're doing front of house on any show, there's a lot of factors that are involved. One's the sound coming from the band. The second is the reflection coming from housing or sides of walls and anything with glass. It will reflect easily. And if somebody's not dancing, then they're probably not enjoying how the music sounds up front on stage. So by adding that, he's probably now cultured his sound a little bit better. So people feel a little bit more comfortable to get closer to the speakers, so they're not busting their eardrums and be able to dance. So, but once again, there's way too many factors and to really deduce why that the SSL kicked in was the answer.
I'm gonna confess I spent some of my misspent youth playing records and discos for people to dance to, pretty big clubs, and the factors that make people want to dance are interesting. I would rank them as being subwoofers, followed immediately by alcohol, followed immediately by content, and you can pretty much stop there. Let's move on.
Okie dokie. From Mike Beardmore. From Reading, UK. In the UK, street lighting is being converted to LEDs. Some people have complained that they strobe in an uncomfortable way. Does this cause problems with video recording also?
Boy, different kinds of lights sure can. Let's have Ken Jordan weigh in, then JJ McKenna.
Yeah, it very much depends on the lights, but I think people just like to complain when there's a change. But yeah, depending on the LEDs, I mean, I'm surrounded by LEDs here without flickering, so it's depending on the quality of LEDs that they put in, whether that issue will occur.
JJ, then Leo, then Sky.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by this driving home one day from office hours. I had my camera on and I noticed that a street sign didn't have letters there in the video versus my eye. I could see the street sign, I could see the whole words, but in the video I couldn't, no matter how I tilted it, and it was because of the refresh rate. But I also noticed that, again, this may be me complaining over much, but when cars and the real lights are LEDs, the strobing effect that happens when I look away, the fact that creates that line of light in my vision when I glance this way or that to me is rather odd. And I'm sure there must be a way to filter that better so that refresh rate doesn't occur for people's eyes.
Going to Leo, Sky, Courtney, then William. So go ahead, Leo.
So very quickly, the camera, or the lights on the majority of the lights in the UK have been changed now in most councils. They all did them about 5 years ago, but some of them were really poorly done. As Ken said, they went to LED, but they went cheap. That won't surprise you. And they do strobe. The later ones haven't. It just depends on which ones they've gone for. But I don't think we've got any literally. Last time I flew in, you can tell because there's the ambience light in the UK is just dropped dramatically when it was all just wash of sodium lights coming back up again.
Sky?
I think another factor is that sodium used to be that warm orangey glow, and now we've gone to that blue or more bright white. And so there's a factor there. And specifically in cinematography in Los Angeles, that was obviously known, and some cinematographers are still carrying around the sodium bulbs to give that more warm evening look.
Courtney?
Another thing to consider, in the UK, they're at 50 hertz, and so if they don't smooth out the AC, it's going to flicker more. Good high-quality LEDs can smooth that out with filtration to make the DC component that the LEDs need consistent and not flicker at 50 hertz as opposed to 60 hertz. And this is normally smoothed out with mercury vapor, sodium lights. You know, even when you turn them off, they take a long time to dim to zero because they're heated up so much. So they never, you'll never see the flicker in a sodium vapor or a mercury vapor light. So the difference can be seen on a camera if it's a cheap LED.
William Hillary.
I know the question is about streetlights, but up in the northern climes where they replaced traffic lights with LED traffic lights, we had the problem of icing. They don't produce enough heat to melt the ice. And so some municipalities had to, you're trying to save money by putting in LEDs, and then they put in a heater
as opposed to a tungsten lamp that heats it. Oh, really? That's fascinating. It just goes to show you, there's no good deed tries to go unpunished. I will say that it used to drive me crazy in the early days of camcorder shooting. Sodium vapor lights, not only do they skew heavily into the orange spectrum, but they do not have full spectrum. And so trying to bring back footage on a camcorder that was shot under sodium vapor and trying to color correct it was an exercise in futility and frustration. So things are better now, I think, across the board. Most of these lights put out more spectrum. And we have things like the color rendering index that you can see on all sorts of sources you buy, which really helps you be able to do good color correction after you shoot something. So let's move on from there.
Okay. Curious anecdote, Bill, but Disney used to use sodium vapor lighting for their, quote, green screen, which was actually yellow screen on all of their early, effects for animation.
They used the color spike to their advantage, I guess. Smart.
From Douglas Carmichael, I'm looking at an upgrade from my 6-core 2013 Mac Pro, and Apple Refurb Store has iMac Pros available up to 14 cores, but Mac Pros available to 16 cores. If budget allows, would I be better off with a Mac Pro for audio, even if it's only 8 cores?
For audio specifically, that's interesting. Let's go ahead to John Puett first.
So it would depend on the speed of the processors, in addition to the number of the cores. If the 14 cores are much faster than the 16 cores, and it's not just the gigahertz, it's also other factors such as the generation of the chips and things like that. So without knowing more details, I'm not sure we can give you an intelligible answer. In theory, 16 cores is better than 14, but if the 14 cores are much faster than the 16, but the pros also use a different type of chip sometimes, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, and this is weird for me to even think about, because I always think of video's the hard stuff to process, audio's the easy stuff. But when you get into tremendously large numbers of multi-channel and you're doing 48 or 96 kilohertz sampling in audio, you get into really big calculation numbers really fast. And, some of those people doing symphonic recording are doing 100 channels at 48 kilohertz or 96 kilohertz. That's a lot of processing. So I think we'd have to talk to and get in one of our audio experts and a specialist to really give you a deep dive into which process does that math better. That's my suspicion, but I may be wrong. So somebody ping into the Q&A system here or into the chat if we're missing the ball on this one. But that's, I think, what we can contribute. Let's move on to the next question.
All right. Eric Nathan from Bellingham, Washington says, my company uses Teams for larger meetings over 100. The last meeting was very bumpy with the main presenter trying to share his screen. Are there any tips for using Teams to produce the highest quality meeting possible?
And John Puett has his hand up first.
Don't use Teams.
I knew somebody was going to say that.
I'm sorry, but Teams is really crappy for meetings like this. Now, that said, if you're stuck with using Teams, you're going to have to train your speakers. You're going to have to do a pre-meeting with every single one of them. And I would do that with Zoom or anything else as well. But with Teams particularly, because it's really more originally designed for user-to-user, person-to-person interaction, it's based off of Skype more or less with a SharePoint interface tacked onto it. You really want to make sure that they're trained and they know where the buttons are and keyboard shortcuts so that you don't run into that. And if it takes 2 or 3 meetings, you need to do that.
So we've got people who are going to weigh in, but I just did one about a week ago on Teams. And I will say, yes, it has its issues, but the pure video quality is as good as anything else right now. And I've actually been impressed that it's gotten better faster than I expected. So let's go through Mark Giuliani, then Jeffrey Powers, then Leo. Go ahead, Mark.
So I'm on a Teams call once a week that has about 150 people on it. And when we share screens, everyone turns off their video, so that you're really just having a call looking at one screen anyway, and that makes a big difference.
Fair enough. Leo and then Jeffrey.
The biggest thing I always find with sharing screens, it's not just about Teams, it's about everything, is that people share with... So they're used to sharing PowerPoint with the fact that they had 2 monitors without thinking they had 2 monitors, because they would have their computer and there was a screen up there. And then they keep sharing PowerPoint and forgetting they don't have a second monitor. They're going, but I can't see everybody. It's like, you always had 2 monitors, and they don't realize that was the case. So you have to make sure that they do the share PowerPoint into the window.
Jeffrey and then Jason Sipe.
Well, first of all, Zoom can be very bumpy in itself, because you got to remember it's a whole bunch of people coming on with different types of computers, different types of audio, different types of video, and the program doesn't know what it is until it gets connected up. So you have to put into effect on that. For a long time, even Zoom was favoring the processor over the graphics processor. So you could have had the best graphics card in there, but a really bad computer, and of course that would cause the problems. We know that if you come in on a Zoom call with under 4 cores, you're not going to get the high quality that everybody else will get.
And Jason Sipe to finish things up.
If you have the ability to switch their presentations yourself or have a technical director, please do that. It helps a lot for the speakers, and you have more control over the videos. I've noticed that whenever anyone does any sort of screen sharing, there is latency because it has to create a new instance of a source input. So if you already have the speaker's presentations ready to go, it seems to work much better. And not only that, you have more control over what you can pin or spotlight for everyone versus yourself.
And Jason, I'm sorry, that was Jason Sky had a hand up there at the end.
I did, because I actually was on the inside of this experience over the last year and watching teams work really hard at Microsoft, update and upgrade their interactive abilities. But practice, I think, is the answer. And is it a better tool? It's a much broader tool. And I think that was a part of the big confusion. Is Teams is not just a video conferencing package. It is a collaborative, interactive, shareable address book. It's a deep tool. So I think if you want to and I observed having a set of what did you say, producers do your show for you, that made the CEOs look amazing, but they didn't know where the buttons they were themselves. So asking people to do all of these magical things that usually a dozen people did for them, it's hard.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question.
Okie doke. Jason Sipe has
That's for the education hour, actually.
Okie dokie.
Oh, okay, so we move somebody who has the buttons, move that over to the left and
to Rupert McRae from Dallas, Texas. And Rupert, you need to know you need to start pronouncing it that way. Microsoft is holding an event regarding securing oops, sorry. Somebody posted something and it moved right when I was reading it. Microsoft is holding an event regarding securing hybrid work. The event is being held on ON24. That is, when will companies start using their own platforms for their own events?
On24, I remember them. Leo?
So actually, I've had a number of discussions with Microsoft about this, and the Microsoft team in Germany don't use Teams for their presentations. Their view is that when they're doing certain things, they use the right tool. I don't see the guys from Daft Trucks driving to work in a truck every day. They may drive in a car, and it just isn't. At the moment, I don't think Microsoft have got the right product for doing certain things. It's not that they don't have a product for everything, but it's just in this case they don't.
Okay, we don't have any other hands, so that seems to be the last. Oh, no, Jason Sipe is here to weigh in.
I would also say that it really kind of depends on the product. I know for me, whenever I'm watching any of Apple's keynotes, I will go and watch it on Safari, specifically because Apple delivers a premium experience. For most other people who don't have an Apple device, they'll watch it on YouTube, they'll watch it elsewhere. So it just depends on who's bringing who into what ecosystem. And I've noticed that for a lot of companies that are here locally, they want to get their information out to as many people as possible. So the more platforms and the more stable and secure platforms they can use, the better, and they'd rather put their branding on that than just keep it in-house.
Fair enough. And I want to thank everybody who's putting in questions and tagging them correctly. I'm seeing in the queue some for EDU, which will be the 9 o'clock hour and beyond. And thank you for doing that. And because some of these are there, I think we're a little short on questions to fill out an entire another hour. So if you haven't asked a question yet, but you're interested in it, please contribute and tag appropriately. And now, Courtney, let's go keep moving on.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael. Many hospitals have used iPads for video conferencing and patient care in the ICU. Why do you think the iPad became the tablet of choice in an industry that has been Windows dominant for decades? How would you manage an iOS device without a Mac?
Okay, let's start with Mark Giuliani, go to John Pruitt, and then Jason Sipe after that. Go ahead, Mark.
I think most of the people that would be using the iPads probably already familiar with the iOS environment from their phones.
And Jason?
HealthKit, security, infrastructure, and consumer and user experience. I've noticed that in my particular healthcare area, it's just easier to use. Whenever anyone tries to fire up a Dell laptop, they have to go through multiple steps to try and put something up on a screen. So it just seems to be user experience and overall.
And John Pruitt.
To what's been stated, I think I'll just add that I think doctors were more likely to be using iPhones and iPads. And when a patient was asking to do it, they probably started using their own equipment. And then the hospitals picked up what the doctors were using because it is secure and it does have all the other advantages listed.
I want to give a shout out to the UI team who did the original iPads. I do think it's hard to remember back, even though it wasn't that long ago, but that experience was pretty extraordinary for a device that had no depth to it. I mean, it was a little slab of glass, and not just the fact that it worked fast and it worked well, but that you could intuit how to operate it, I think, as well as any device I have ever seen manufactured and sold. I remember my wife looked at my very first one and immediately said, I want one of those now. And I think she just resonated with how it operated and how easy it was to get stuff done. So I think that was pretty much a watershed. And we know now that touch interfaces are everywhere. I think that was the watershed breakthrough. Courtney, and then John Pruitt again.
I think one of the reasons is because Windows tablets are running on the Intel architecture, and they're using ARM architecture for the iOS, and so they get much better battery life out of the iPad than they do out of a Windows tablet. So I think that's a key consideration, and why, of course, the software, and they're all running custom software for medical applications. A lot of it is custom software. So it has to be written to port to the iOS, and that's the route they went, I think, mainly for battery life.
And John?
So to feedback on what you said, Bill, and one other point as well, when it was first released, I remember people saying, oh, it's just a big iPhone. But when you used it, you realized that it may look like that, but it behaved very differently. So it wasn't just a big iPhone. As far as the second part of the question, where they would manage a device without a Mac, well, one, you would have a Mac, but you don't necessarily need multiple. But then you would use a cloud management tool like Jamf. Once you enroll it with certificates, you don't need the Mac anymore, and you're able to manage it very, very easily. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, they do have three free licenses if you sign up for it. So JAMF is the tool that a lot of people use for managing not just iPads and iPhones, but also Macs.
Fair enough. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Stan Chen in Roseville. I've been getting blank screen or weird scrambled video input from my ATEM Mini Extreme ISO into Zoom randomly. Restarting the Zoom app and power cycling the ATEM fixes it. Bug in Zoom client or the ATEM?
And Mark Giuliani raised his hand. So did Leo. Quickly, Mark.
I had the same problem, and I was using a Thunderbolt cable instead of a USB-C cable, and that made all the difference in the world once I switched it out.
You're getting a thumbs up from John Preto. Leo, do you want to say something else, or is that the key? That's the key. He's given us another thumbs up.
Cables.
Yep.
Cables. That seems to be the billboard for today's show. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Douglas Carmichael. Would LED video walls have refresh rate issues that could cause the same uncomfortable strobing effects as LED streetlights?
I haven't heard about that, but I do know, particularly we have to be sensitive to the fact there are people who have various forms of epilepsy or things other than that. And strobe lights we've all heard that strobe lights can trigger attacks. So you have to be careful when you're flashing anything. I'm sure there's a lot of medical study on this, but let's go to Leo Mindell and then Courtney Gooden.
Yeah, the way that high power LEDs work is they do strobe, but there is so many of them now. There are so many out there, literally everything you could buy. In fact, it will be illegal in the UK to buy new bulbs which are not LED from the end of this year, I think it is. So we've outlawed anything that isn't LED. So it's difficult, but there are technologies and things are getting better and better and better. If you think back to the old ones, it's always used to be in theaters when they put them on the lines of the steps going up. And as you walked up the lines of the steps, your eyes would sort of go because they were always on those steps in the theaters. But they're so much better these days.
Courtney.
And manufacturers know about this problem because most large-scale LED video walls are meant to be photographed by cameras, which have certain refresh issues and artifact issues if you're running them at too slow a refresh rate. So they're usually running at a pretty high refresh rate for the individual LEDs, so that it shouldn't be a problem with anyone with epilepsy or anything could trigger an uncomfortable state of health off of the flicker, because they're usually running at too high a frequency rate to avoid artifacts in photographing them.
Fair enough. Let's move on to the next question. I hope we have enough discussion time here for we may run a little short today, so I'm going to encourage again those of you who are watching as participants or as producers to ramp it up a little bit. Jeffrey Powers, go ahead. You have your hand up?
Well, you got to ask the question first.
Oh, that's right. Next question then. Oh, you're ready for the next question. I thought maybe you had an interjection on the question handling since you were helping with that. All right.
Jeffrey Powers has that time machine. He goes into the future.
That's right. Go ahead, Courtney.
From Stan Chen in Roseville. I still can't get rid of the black bars on my Blackmagic PCC 6K pocket cinema camera into my ATEM. Followed the Discord channel suggestions with no luck. Changed out the HDMI cable. The 6K selection is grayed out, so 5.7K seems to get the closest. Any answers?
Jeffrey had his hand up, so let's honor it. Go ahead, and then Mark Giuliani.
The official answer from Blackmagic is if you're going anything over 30 frames a second, that's when you're going to get those black bars. You can't do 60 frames a second on the Blackmagic. And of course, I believe I don't think resolution has anything to do with it. So get it at 30 frames a second, see what happens, and get back to us.
Okay, Mark Giuliani.
1 to 30 for the shutter speed, and that will, or 1/30, and that will allow the 6K to open up and the black bars will go away.
There you go. So a simple fix. Dive into your menus, reset, and you should be fine. Let's move on.
Okay, Douglas Carmichael. In the studio networking lab rack I'm designing, I'm debating between a 1U or 2U server as a VMware host. I've heard that 1U servers can be noisier than 2U servers. What has been your experience, and would you be looking at the best, and would looking at the noise specs be my best bet?
And that'll be an interesting discussion. I mean, rack units in terms of One rack unit, the only thing I have ever felt about putting in one rack unit is that the heat load gets a little high if your devices are putting that out. If I had a choice of two devices, they both did exactly the same thing, and one was 2, and I wasn't fighting for space in a short use thing, I would probably go with 2 rack units, but let's see what everybody else thinks. John Pewitt and then Jeffrey Powers.
I'm going to advocate for keeping your servers in a different room. That way the noise won't matter. I'm assuming we're talking about the volume of the servers. It's probably louder for the one use because there's more constriction of the airflow. And so I would definitely think about looking at running your servers in another room, because you're going to probably be running them headless anyway and accessing them with remote tools. So
Jeffrey,
try to move them.
Excuse me, Jeffrey, then Leo Mendel.
Yeah, server room with a KVM switch. That's usually what I do. 1U versus 2U. Yeah, definitely. Everything's smaller, so fans run a little bit more than a 2U would. But good airflow in there can bring down some of the noise as well. And of course, it really depends on what you're doing the 1U unit for. If you are doing it for the VMware host, and you've got a lot of connections in there, yeah, you might like the 2U simply because of the fact you could probably expand to it a little bit better. But yeah, it really depends on what you're doing and using it for.
Leo and then Mark Giuliani to finish.
Yeah, so anybody who's worked in a server farm data center will tell you that they were not designed about being quiet. They supply you earplugs as you go in. You need them because it's that loud. And it is loud when you've got racks and racks of 1U servers, and it's 1U servers which are the problem. It's also 1U things like network switches. So occasionally when I buy network switches and I want to put them outside of a rack, I'll actually take the case off and I'll put a new fan, a big fan that size on the top, instead of the small, really screamy fans that are inside. But I would exactly do what John said. Don't have your servers in the room, especially if you're doing anything to do with audio. You'll hate it. You'll hate it.
Mark Giuliani to finish things up.
Yes, the 1Us I found to be noisier. They're all noisy when they start up, no matter how many Us they are. But one thing you have to consider is the air temperature in that facility, and you might have a room that you're in for your control room or whatever that's on a building system that shuts down at a certain time of day and then starts back up at a certain time of day. And for a server room, you're probably going to want a separate system that runs 24/7.
Fair enough. Let's move on to the next question.
Okie dokie from Doug Carmichael. Would the use of LED lighting fixtures be a significant benefit for reducing temperatures and humidity on stage, or would other steps need to be taken as well?
John Pewitt.
So temperature, yes. Humidity, no. You're going to have to do something else to handle the humidity, because lights have nothing to do with the amount of water in the environment.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Oh, you were muted, Bill. Sorry. Yes, and I've noticed a big difference when, because now not only the lights in the room, but the lights used on the stage, cinema lights, are now all switching to LED, and it makes a huge difference because there's two types of heat that can come off of a cinema lamp, which you're pointing some of radiant heat and resistive heat. Resistive heat is gone pretty much away. It's reduced to 1/20th of what a incandescent bulb would generate. Radiant heat you're still going to feel a little bit of, because there's some infrared. If it's tungsten balanced heat, you'll feel more of that infrared on the person. But as far as adding to the heat of the room to handle air conditioning and everything, you'll find it much easier to air condition a studio with LED lighting.
Let's go to Mark Giuliani, then Leo, then Jeffrey Powers.
So there'll be much less heat with the LEDs, and I would argue, in fact, that there'd be a lot less humidity with the older lights, because they'd burn off some of that humidity in the room.
Leo?
So the other thing that the LEDs are going to do is reduce the amount of time that a stage or theatre is down, because they don't have to do all the replacements. So at the moment, they typically only run stage theatres to half of their advertised life expectancy of the bulbs, so they don't blow out. So they're going to reduce. That will mean there'll be less and less outages of stages or venues being down to have to replace, because the LED bulbs just go for a long time.
Jeffrey Powers.
Stages have high ceilings, so usually LED or any type of lighting is about halfway down. That way, any type of heat rises up above it. But if you have a lower ceiling, the better thing is to, if you can play with the ventilation system, actually get vents, escape vents right above the lights. That way the heat will escape there and completely bypass the lights. As for humidity, just like John said, humidity is humidity. Put down some dehumidifiers to cool down the room.
And I'd just like to add a couple little things into the discussion. I've had a couple of inexpensive LEDs that caused me great problems. In one area, it was sound, and I was shocked because when I added that to the outside of my studio, back when I had the Pocket Studio in Scottsdale, every time it came on, it injected a tremendous amount of noise into the electrical system. So just be aware of that. I imagine that that's less expensive and probably older LED-based lights, but that was a deal for me. The other thing is that obviously dimming an LED works on a different system than dimming an incandescent style of light. It uses high-speed switching to turn it off and on. And so just make sure that if you're doing a lot of video and things like that, you're paying attention. Most of the time, I don't see a problem in these days with the modern ones. They've done a lot of work on that. But in the old days, if you dimmed something down below, I would get flicker. So just test. Maybe before you buy a case of something, bring one in, test it in the circumstance you're going to be using it, and make sure that none of these little oddball problems show up. Let's move on. Next question.
Okay, Eric Nathan from Bellingham, Washington says, are there any suggestions for a compact green screen lighting setup for travel or tight spaces?
Okay, who wants to talk about the green screen stuff? I guess if nobody else does, I'll say a few things about it since I've done a good bit of that over the course of my career. Yes, there are plenty of pop-up green screen panels you can get. The real keys to green screen have always been consistency of lighting of the green screen compared to the subject in front of the green screen. And that involves not only the type of lights you use on each thing, but also the distance that you have. Alex, who is an expert at green screen lighting, talks often about having enough depth in the set that you're working on so that you can light the green screen separately from the talent without getting a lot of spill on your talent from the lights on the green screen. That is a key thing. Using a high quality green screen, making sure that it is as wrinkle free as you can get it, at the very least around the subject that you are shooting. Hopefully the entire scene will be evenly lit and consistent as measured by scopes. That will get you the best thing. And then the camera type you use, the resolution that it puts out, will also impact the quality of the green screen that you can pull off there usually. So we've got a lot of hands up actually in the middle of all that. So let's go to Jeffrey, then Ken. Go ahead.
Last year we had I can't remember who it was. I think his name was Mike, green screen expert, talk on office hours, and you can definitely check that in the YouTube archives. And I asked a very similar question to that, and a couple things, because one of the things I was wondering is, could you actually have a light box green screen? That would work. And he basically said, make sure that that your green screen is one f-stop darker than your foreground. That way you can chroma key it better, and it's less chance of casting a shadow onto the green screen. So of course, light position very important. And of course, a well lit room will you won't have to worry too much about extra lighting.
Ken Jordan.
Yeah, it's just a green screen and tight spaces, just the two don't match. It's you can't have a green screen in a tight space, not if you want to. Oh, should you be using a green screen in the first place is another question, because I would recommend, if you're going to be traveling and there's a tight space, not to use a green screen. Have a 20% gray or light gray screen behind you is a much better option than trying to create some virtual background, which we all know what our opinion are on virtual backgrounds.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'll go a step beyond that. Everybody, I'm seeing so many of these meetings now where the green screen, and even if it's not a green screen, they're using this new technology that tries to separate the individual from the background and puts a virtual background behind them, even without a green screen. When that fails, it fails so remarkably and magnificently and horribly that it really renders your presentation almost unwatchable. I was switching a thing in Teams the other day, and this is not Teams' fault, but literally the woman who was speaking had her hair disappearing like every second and a half, and I just couldn't watch the presentation. So it is more critical than ever, if you're trying to do any kind of virtual background or green screen, that you monitor what you're shooting and what you're putting out while you're doing it. And if someone sees you doing that, find some other way to do that, please, because it's horrible for staying engaged in the content, which is the purpose of you being there watching it. Leo has his hand up, wants to add something.
I was only going to add that while typically I'm not a fan of green screens, I would say that on AV Tech Talks, Ed Wilcock always runs with a green screen, and a lot of people don't realize it is a green screen. They think that's his mixer behind him, because it is done really well.
Yeah, if you learn all the steps and do it well, it should be invisible. I mean, people should just think this is the person talking to me, much like office hours. And we typically do not use green screens. This is just a real background behind me, lit to be the background. Courtney, go ahead, and then Jeffrey, and then David.
There is a type of green screen that uses a retroreflective screen and a ring light that is green that goes around the lens of the camera to generate a clean green screen. But I would not propose that for travel, because a retroreflective screen are fairly delicate, and trying to roll them up and keep them from going bad without creasing them or knocking the retroreflective elements off would be a problem. So don't go that route if you're going to travel.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with those. That's a lot of money to fold and break. Jeffrey Powers, and then David Brady.
If you have a chair like John Pewitt has, where it's got producing clean lines on a very constant basis, you'll have a better chance. First of all, it'll probably hide a lot of the shadows, but second of all, it'll have a better chance of actually getting that match between the two, and then you won't have to use too much blur into your chroma key, so you can at least look halfway decent on that.
David Brady.
And I just wanted to clarify that this is actually green lighting and not a green screen behind me.
Okay. Point made. Let's move on to the next question.
Okay. James Babbitt of San Diego says, Back to the Future was on Netflix through June 30th. What is involved when movies are no longer available and removed by Netflix?
Oh,
I don't know what he means by
okay.
what's involved.
Well, there are way more movies than hours necessary to play them on a monthly schedule. And so I think every streaming service retires movies and brings new movies in every month to keep the audience refreshed and engaged. John Pewitt?
I'll just point out that it may be removed from where you're located, but it may not be removed from Netflix globally. So with the right technology, you can watch it later. I think it's more to do with licensing terms and agreements, and Netflix not wanting to pay for more than, say, a year to stream a movie at a time, because it could be more expensive to go for longer.
Interesting. Courtney, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, and it goes along the line of what John was just saying, is that the licensing deals now are constantly changing, because almost all the studios are now there's Paramount Plus, there's Peacock, there's, so whoever holds the rights to Back to the Future may be now reserving it for their own streaming channel. So you can still probably find it. Just go to the studio that produced it and look for it there on their streaming channel. It'll probably be there.
So the bottom line, which is a little sad, is that you have to subscribe to more services if you want to get access to as many pieces of content as possible, because these barriers do get put up. All right, moving on.
Okay, Jason Sipe from Murrieta says, a typical multicam setup used to be 3 cameras. Many of the multicam event setups I've started seeing state a minimum of 4 cameras. Does the industry appear to be shifting to a higher minimum for multi-camera events?
John Pewitt. Whoops, your Zoom muted.
Thank you. Mine's more of a question is, didn't the 3-cam setup come from sitcoms and doing it on a soundstage? And so when we're seeing stuff, whenever you were seeing something like the Emmys or the Oscars, you were seeing multiple cams, more than 3 cams anyway. So wouldn't that be what that's from?
Yeah, generally, I think Lucille Ball's husband, Desi Arnaz, is widely argued as the creator of the 3-camera live switch sitcom format. and it was, it stayed 3 cameras. And when you think about it, you've got a wide shot and a close-up as the 2 most dominant ways to shoot people. If you have more than one person talking on stage, if you're switching from the wide shot to the close-up, having a 3rd camera allows them to frame another close-up and still preserve the wide shot. So 3 is a good starting number. Of course, now that everybody's carrying a camera in their pocket, it wouldn't be surprising to me if in a big concert there was 10,000 cameras rolling, and that brings up a whole other issue with dealing with that much media content. But let's go around the panel. David Brady's going to go next, then Courtney, and then let's move on.
Yeah, that's some of the things we've done at work. We added a 4th camera to our multifunction room, if only to get audience reactions and questions in events. So that's one of the reasons I could see.
Yeah, and even in the 3 cameras, swinging 1 camera around to pick up audience shots, perfectly reasonable solution. Courtney?
And in live events, whenever they come back, there's use for IMAG as well as streaming. So you may want to have a different camera doing the IMAG work on a big screen than you do for sending out what's going out to the streaming audience. So additional cameras now are being required because you're doing a hybrid event where you need more coverage for the people in the room plus the people down the line on the YouTubes.
And just to address jargon watch, IMAG is short for image magnification, and that's when you see the Steve Jobs type presentation. There's a huge screen. That's the image magnification behind the presentation. So that's the shorthand for that usually. All right, let's move on. Next question.
Okay, Douglas Carmichael says, it was mentioned to use dehumidifiers as one tool to make stages more comfortable. Would there be models that pipe the water somewhere else? Of course, you have to do that instead of needing manual emptying. That is really a requirement.
Let's go with Leo and then John Pruitt.
Well, literally the majority of air conditioners are also dehumidifiers because it's exactly the same technology. And then they have a condensate pump, or they have a condensate flow that's down. If you do it properly, you run the condensate so it goes out without a pump, so you don't have that annoying noise.
And John Pruitt nodded as if it took care of it. Yeah. Okay. So Mark Giuliani has things to say.
So you got to be careful about over dehumidifying because you'll create a possibility for static electricity with all the electronics that are around. Number one. Number two, you probably want to talk to your local mechanical engineer who will know how to get the right amount of water out. And also number three, most of the portable units do have a way to hook a hose up to them and figure out where to put the water instead of emptying out the bucket all the time.
Leo Mindell.
And I would just add back to what Marcus just said, that there are some musical instruments, in particular pianos, that don't like to be dehumidified. They like to be, otherwise you're going to lose the tune on them.
Ah, okay. So there's subtle, I don't even know the right word for it. Let's just move on.
Subtleties.
Subtleties. That's exactly what I was trying to say. Yeah. Move on to the next question.
All right. From Alex Alegnowitz from Toronto. Any recommendations for a sequencer control for PTZ cameras?
Sequencing control. So I guess Alex is, I'd like to know a little more, but Leo, do you want to take a shot at what he might mean? And Jeffrey,
I can do, we've done a lot of this on the Stream Deck. If you literally all of the PTZ cameras all run using the same Sony control system, and you can sit there and do it. It's very interesting. I've seen some really interesting thing of people with bird dogs that they're able to sit there and do that shot. I can't tell you what it's called, but somebody else will be able to tell me where they focus on a shot and then they slowly zoom in onto the shot and then move to another wide, and then they do that movement.
Oh, a push and a camera dolly in, dolly out, maybe. Jeffrey Powers?
Yeah, Stream Deck with Companion. You can do a lot of delayed stuff, so you can have it start on one, switch to the camera, and then have the PTZ do a pan, stop, and then do another pan after so many milliseconds. If you're using a Mac, QLab, that's what QLab's based on, and to be able to move things around and switch cameras and stuff like that. So that would be if you're on Windows, there are QLab alternatives too.
And just based on the word sequence, I wonder if he's thinking about having 6 PTZ cameras on one controller and then moving it from one to the next to the next to the next. I don't really, we'll see. Obviously, check the manufacturer of your cameras and see what's available for you. Leo, do you have a last thought?
Only that the 4K version of vMix also has PTZ control. I don't believe it's in anything below the 4K, but I may be wrong.
Okay, let's move on. Next question.
Okay, from Brian Schwartz in Baltimore. Of all the 4K TVs now on sale, what would be the best choice? 50 inches or larger for displaying only still photography originating from a MacBook Pro?
That means you're going to want HDMI in. Courtney, go ahead.
Yeah, you will want HDMI in, and the sweet spot for consumer LCD 4Ks is 55 inches because that's the most number of panels produced, so you will get the best price on a 55-incher. So that's my input.
I will say that I've been surprised. My overhead program monitor, which I usually use when clients are behind me, as they used to be a year ago and now are starting to come back. It's an old Sony XBR TV. I've had it for probably 7 or 8 years, but I've been amazed that it's really holding up incredibly well in terms of a secondary monitor. It's fed through HDMI with the signal coming out of my MacBook Pro. And I often turn it on because when people are presenting here on office hours things with small text at a high density, I've been shocked because my old thought was consumer TV, I'm not going to read small type on it, but this thing actually works really, really well for that. And so even consumer level TVs have enough resolution, pitch, and accuracy to be very useful. And that used to not be the case. So I think that's great. Leo Mindell?
Yeah, there's a lot, as has been said before, about the 4Ks, that the price range at the moment is super great. Hisense are the sponsors of the Euro 2020s at the moment, so there's a glut of their TVs because, of course, they built them all and had them all planned for a sponsorship that they were doing a year ago. So there are now tons and tons of them. But one of the things I would say, my personal preference is to stay away from OLED, particularly if you're driving it from a PC, because you could just leave a screen on for too long and you will burn through with the same picture.
Courtney?
And you might want to choose one that has HDR and supports HDMI 2.0 for HDR, so you can have the higher bit depth for your color from your MacBook Pro, and you'll get much better resolution on your photographs.
That seems reasonable buy for where we're going, not for where we've been. Jason Sipe has a final comment.
Just a quick heads up, if you do get like a QLED, if you look behind me over my hand, you'll see my mouse moving. So if you get a QLED or a quantum LED TV, you'll see that the way in which the pixels light up, it's more passive. It's not like OLED. So you will get a little bit of that phasing, whereas OLED is opening up each of the individual pixels or sending light to each of the individual pixels specifically.
All right, let's move on to the next question.
Okay, Stan Chan from Roseville. What are the latest hybrid tips for getting remote and in-person engagements to work well together? Not doing hybrid is not an option.
Yeah, so Stan, we've been talking about this a lot for the last couple of years, and I have felt the same thing out there. A lot of people are just demanding to do hybrid, even though we all talk quite a bit about the fact that when you do hybrid, you're either paying primary attention to your live audience or primary attention to your broadcast audience, for lack of a better term, your online audience. And it's hard to serve them both as well as possible when you're trying to split your attention. But that said, anybody have any tips for things? Has anybody seen any hybrid events that you thought worked particularly well? And if so, is there anything that you saw happening in there that people who are trying to do this can learn from? John Pruitt?
I'm going to make a recommendation based off of what the panel has discussed. Not that I've had a lot of experience with hybrid stuff, but I'm always willing to talk. I would recommend trying to get the speakers out of the room and show the video to the people live. And having the speakers out of the room makes everybody virtual, makes the hybrid people on level with the non-hybrid people. And that way you're not favoring one audience for the other. And then when it comes time to have live people in the audience, have another set of people dedicated to the hybrid audience that can focus on them and work with them, because their needs are going to be very different than the needs of the people in the live space.
That's actually an interesting concept, John, because I was wondering, you get these big speakers, the Tony Robbins types, and I wonder if it makes sense to have a solely for hybrid part in the beginning and then let them walk on, do a little bit of the live in person, because every presenter I've ever talked to, and I used to work a lot with the National Speakers Association, and that's just those kind of people, they love the interaction with the audience. So maybe a time period where you have that for the live presenter, they can get their fix of audience interaction, but then go back to handling the online audience as an equal. That's interesting. David Brady has his hand up, and so does Jason Seid, and so does Jeffrey Powers. We're going to go to David next.
Yeah, I would say if you can't avoid splitting that audience, at least some sort of fold back confidence monitor for talent to see, and having the ability to spotlight any active speaker from the distance thing into them, so they're kind of in their face as best as possible.
Jason?
There's this video, I believe, that Alex did back in 2012 with Taylor Swift, where she had to interact with her audience in the room, as well as interact with people over Google Hangouts. This is from 2012, I believe. So you'll see she's really good at talking with the camera, but then being able to answer questions from the audience in person, and then being able to go back, shifting back to answer questions online with people that are in Hangouts are pretty good. The key here, though, is the talent. Your talent really needs to be able to go back and forth between doing stuff in person and online. And if you can get that interaction back and forth and have your talent understand that there is going to be latency between what's happening in the room and what's happening online, things tend to work out better. But it really comes down to talent, I would say. Make sure your talent is practiced, that they know where they're going, that you have a good rhythm set up, and feel out that rhythm as you're going through stuff too, because a lot of people just go and do a thing because that's what they want to do in the moment. And with a lot of hybrid events, it's very difficult to produce a quality hybrid event if you're trying to go from your gut and in the moment because of that latency factor.
Let's go to Jeffrey and then Leo.
So I've done a lot of in-person stuff, and I've been trying to record some of this stuff for my channel. And the big thing that I always say is that for the in-person stuff, they shouldn't treat it like this is a conference room call. In fact, there was one I went into, and they were literally sitting around a conference table with a speakerphone in front of them. Makes it hard to hear, especially if somebody comes in and out of the room. And of course they don't have to have this type of setup. If they're demonstrating something, they don't use the iPhone and the iPhone camera. Try and get something a little bit more higher quality into the room so they can be in front. So when somebody asks a question, gets an answer, you're not hearing a whole bunch of room noise or anything like that. And that'll make that part easy.
Yeah. Leo and then Sky.
So Hopin, who, as we all know about, who bought StreamYard and are in their view, the kings of the hybrid or the kings of the online, are producing their first ever hybrid event in 3 days' time. It's called July the 7th, and it's called Illuminate. So if you have a look, you can sign up to that. So they are saying that they're going to show the world what hybrid should look like. It will be worth attending, because so far their use of their own tech has been interesting.
It'd be interesting. I wonder if we should put something put a link in the Q&A, and maybe this is something to discuss on Discord and get a party together to watch it, because that's a pretty bold claim that they figured out how to do hybrid better than anybody else. Sky Gleason, go ahead.
Leo is so polite. The word interesting. I'm wondering if we can learn from history with regards to the previous houses of worship that used to do what were called satellite, where the band would be in these different locations at different venues, but then at some point the speaker would come in on a big projection. So I'm wondering if there's something to be learned there, because what I'm hearing Jason talk about is managing the expectation of your audience and letting them know they are the one that is being talked to, but at some point, they're also knowing they're the ones that are watching somebody else being talked to. So it's kind of I'm wondering if there's something to learn there.
Yeah, you know what resonates with me is this performance thing, because I watch back in these and I cringe at the little time I spend with eye contact with my theoretical audience. I keep glancing around because I have so many things to try to keep track of, and my own performance drives me crazy. So I do think that original point about Taylor Swift being such a skilled performer, and she's paid attention to how she should do this and does it brilliantly, and a lot of us not so much. William Hillary, go ahead.
Yes, coming down to a person who's very talented speaking, best I had ever seen, and it was not involving technology. Everybody was in the same room. It's just that it was a house of worship situation where there were two different programs going on that came together for a final talk. One was in French, one was in English. And so the room recognized that 10 minutes was spent speaking to this group, 15, back again 15, back again 15, finished off with 10. And so before we ever had these hybrids, this was very much, you've got two different groups of people. People who are bilingual enjoyed it in that what was being said, and the content was being repeated, but it was being reinforced. And then there was a little bit of jealousy every once in a while because there would be a play on words. You know, one group was laughing at a part of the talk that nobody else laughed at in their group. So it was just fabulous.
Yeah, those are good lessons about the differences in the host keying on this or keying on that or keying on something else. I think that's everybody in this topic. So let's move. Oh, JJ has a hand up.
Actually, a point to that is I've often been in the translator. I've often been in a room where to say, because there, unfortunately, sometimes there is no translation for a thing that's said in one language to another. So to use an idiom in the other language, in my primary language, Spanish, makes it easier to convey that. Thus, it has a slightly different meaning, as it were, because of the translation. As I was thinking this morning, we had Hasmukh asking something very similar to this regarding hybrid events, and having the two audiences. I myself was thinking about, would I really say everyone throw away your book when trying to teach? If we're looking at moving forward in technology, because a book is actually rather high tech. Before there was written word, there was spoken word, and so would we really be willing to throw away the entire idea of the written word? Or would we really I can't speak. Would we be very willing to throw away technology? That is to say, do we want to get rid of the idea of technology in classrooms, or making a classroom that is entirely technology? And maybe this is second hour, and the reason I say that about second hour is I beg of you folks who don't have tags in your questions, I can't see those questions right now because I only can see first hour questions. I know there's other questions there, but I cannot see them. So please tag your questions so I can move them into the question queue. Thank you.
Yeah, there are more questions in the EDU set. They're waiting, but we also have about 7 more to get through. And since we only have basically 10 minutes left before we have to make the transition, we're going to accelerate our pace a little bit. Courtney?
Excuse me, what about microphone checks for the coming in?
We're going to try to do something. I think I will do some before we get in there. So we'll pay attention to the people who have been on the panel yet.
And I will not be able to be for the education segment to read the questions. So they will have to work between themselves to work that out. All right. The next question's from Douglas Carmichael. With the discussions of the value of in-person collaboration, do you think that the residential studio model, popular in the 70s and 80s, where the artist lives on site and can focus on the production with minimal distractions, could work in today's music industry?
Leo?
I think it is. I think it's happening more and more. And because it's relatively cheap to get reasonably good equipment at home, at least to do a certain level of production. You're never going to replace the acoustics of certain well-known venues, but you are going to be able to lay down a lot of your tracks to some extent.
Jason?
content beware, but if you watch Inside with Bo Burnham on Netflix, you will see what happens when a musical artist is given two Panasonic Lumix SL1s and has a back room on his property and is stuck inside for a year. It is quite literally one of the better albums I've heard out of the pandemic. And not only that, the way in which to use video to help make and sell his point. He did all the lighting, all the audio, all the video, everything he did by himself. So it's a great exercise in understanding what someone can do if they're willing to be able to harness the technology and harness the tools and know how to use them. Just beware of the content. It is not appropriate for children.
Courtney?
Yeah, if you're a fan of Ben Folds, he did the thing during all his quarantine. He was locked in a room for several months. On Saturdays, he'd do a live stream. It's just him, a digital piano, and his MacBook Pro, and he would interact with Patreon contributors to take requests and interact with them. And he'd also give little lessons on, why he created this piano riff and this song, etc. And it was very entertaining, all by himself, the only person in the room. So it does work.
And let's not forget what a tremendous failure Billie Eilish and her brother Phineas were stuck in their little bedroom at home for all that time. JJ?
I'd also point at Victor, for instance, in our group here, who, again, kept on pushing, if anything, pushed far forward in the medium what his previous experiences have been, and it continues to do so. The collaboration we see that Todd's put in his session 2 Thursdays ago, and what that can do, that really taking the idea of having a studio and actually pushing the audio someplace else to another person who has more tools in their DAW, that audio mixing collaboration actually can get a lot more.
I actually think this is worthy of a whole second hour almost, because the collaborative versus individual thing is just a stew that is being whipped and blended into new things. And it's really exciting what's happening out there. But we don't have time to talk about all that because we have more questions to get through. So let's hit the next one.
It seems from Douglas Carmichael to be kind of a follow-up to the previous question. If you could make the residential studio model work, could it be a marketable venue for live-streamed events if the setting became as much a part of the event as the talent? If you marketed it properly, I could see the studio becoming a brand itself.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes and no on that. I just want to caution you to watch out. If you're suddenly turning your home into a business, there's all sorts of regulations and municipal issues and things like that. I mean, are you suddenly going to do parking in your street because you've got 5 musicians coming on Thursday to record a live webcast? There's just a whole bunch of things, and that's why I think this is a good maybe topic for a second hour rather than doing it. Let's really quickly, Jeffrey, just got a few thoughts.
Yeah, my band actually we call them stay-at-home shows during the pandemic. We all came into, because my studio has extra rooms, they went into their own rooms, put a camera in each room, and of course we did our show, which was kind of a little bit tougher. But I could kind of see this being on a local level, something that would be a little bit more produced. On that same line, you also have to worry about too many people gathering at one place, and then the question of whether you become a venue versus a home residential. But streaming it out to the people, at least the people that are still under any type of quarantine or anything like that, they have the ability to watch your shows. So the hybrid movement, there might be some possible revenue in that. Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question.
Okie dokie. There it is. Jesse Mills from San Francisco Bay Area. Is there a way to fully control an iPad remotely other than switch control?
Does anybody use an iPad and do remote control of it? I know you can control an iPad from an iPhone or back and forth. I mean, all the iDevices will talk to each other. And in things like teleprompting and stuff like that, it is pretty easy for them to do Wi-Fi remote control or Bluetooth remote control of most of the interface assets. But let's go to Jeffrey, Courtney, and then Jason real quick.
I have remote kits, and all my remote kits are Android only because of the fact that you cannot personally control it. With the Android, I can use TeamViewer or another remote control software to come in and control the camera, do the adjustments that I need to. Otherwise, you have to have the person do the work. It'll highlight what you want them to do, but they'll have to do the work.
Courtney, and then Jason.
Yeah, what Jeffrey said. And usually it's usually the other way around. The iPad is used as a remote control for some other piece of hardware or software.
Fair enough. Let's move on. Next question.
Okay, from Tony Mobley. From Noonan, I guess. What is the preferred dock for the M1 iPad Pro want to use as a mobile setup or on vacation or in a hotel space?
So I don't know if Tony's interested in using the camera and the audio. Or let's have Ken weigh in. Ken?
Yeah, as you particularly mentioned mobile, I own literally all of the OWC docks. They do a specific one which is for mobile because all the other ones come with an enormous brick. So this one you need to use the power supply from the iPad to power it. But then with this you get you can plug it in. You've got Ethernet, you have HDMI, and you have 2 USB ports on it as well. So that's what I'd recommend for travel.
Quick, John Pruitt, and then we'll move on.
So I use the hyperdrive. Leah Laporte recommended it. It doesn't have an Ethernet port, but it does have HDMI out and SD card slots and USB-C and USB and a headphone. So it's another option. It's a little less expensive. It's about $80 or so.
Let's move on to the next question.
Okay, from Shy Gleason. Oh, sorry, Sky, you didn't put the pronunciation in there. From Seattle, it says, in Zoom, where is the checkbox that turns on and off the time of show in the upper right corner of the gallery view?
David Brady.
Yes, it's from the Zoom launch window, settings, general, and one of the tick boxes there is show current time or something to that effect, and it throws off that little pip.
And I think that's it. So let's move on to the next question.
From Rick Combs in Columbia, Tennessee. Has something happened to the live streaming on YouTube with office hours? I can watch it a day later, but not live. Also on Mukana Mobile, I can read the questions real time, but when I click on the play button, I get an earlier day session. He's talking about the playback feature or the audio feature in Mukana.
Anybody have any thoughts? Jeffrey, go ahead.
So basically what happens is I'm doing the streaming of this whole thing, and we're using a different channel right now, and we're moving it over to the YouTube, the regular YouTube at this point. There might be some upcoming changes in the next month, so it's very important to go to officehours.global to find the live stream going, because we have been live streaming every single day. So officehours.global is where you want to go to find out where that is. And of course, go into Mukana desktop. I'm not sure why the other half, we double check it, triple check it to make sure that it's working there. So that's what I got.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. I've lost my Mukana operator panel, so I don't know what happened there, but let's just dive through. We'll finish up.
Okay, from Gilberto from Santa Cruz, Bolivia. An OS 10 10.14 on OS 10 10.14 when telling VLC to go full screen on a selected screen through Companion, the creating a new desktop space animation shows up. Any workaround to prevent that? VLC or OS 10 OS X settings?
Who's up? Let's see, do I have my mic? Sorry, I've got so many things going on here. I'm trying to relog in. And no, okay, I'm live. So David Brady, sorry about that. Got distracted.
No problem. I'm not certain if it's the same thing that I put in a couple days ago, but from settings, mission control, there's a tick box for forcing spaces to have individual monitors or something. Each display has a separate space. I think that might be what VLC is pulling off if that's not checked.
Okay, moving on to the last question.
Okay, Douglas Carmichael is back once again with his remote studio question. When I mentioned residential studios, I meant the often rural facilities like the former Ridge Farm in the UK. And he has a link. Could a setting of that type make sessions more collaborative and or productive?
Okay. Anybody want to handle that real quick? That looks like we're whiffing on this one, but that's okay. We're kind of at the end of things. Yep, crickets. There we go. So let's see. Randall Willis, that last question, is that for the current things, or are we going to move in? No, let's go ahead.
That one's actually for me. I'll just take it directly if you want.
Great. Thank you, David.
In the pre-show, I had asked for a setting on my particular camera. When I toggled that setting, it brings up like the on-screen face identification. So it was like that Terminator reticle trying to focus on my head. And it's been off since. So sorry about that.
That's okay. All right. Gosh, this is I'm trying to log back in case I have to do the voiceover checks, but I think that takes care of our regular questions. Thank you all for participating in regular office hours today. We're going to move on to the education thing, and we are letting people in as we go. Those of you who are educators, this is your time to come in. You're going to rumble around for just a minute or so, and the teachers all kind of settle in, and then I'm going to try to run a mic check if I can get the panel back up. So I'm right now clicking on a bunch of relogins saying, show me all the school buses. This is always so much fun.
For this, YouTube is going bye-bye. So
bye-bye to our YouTube audiences. Thank you for coming by today. We appreciate it. We'll see you all tomorrow. All right.